Morning, everybody, and welcome. Just waiting for participants to come on for a moment or two. Okay, we might make a start. Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Yvonne, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Yvonne.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I am the elected Deputy Chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land I am on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you, and the ancestors' lands that you are on or are from. It is always a humbling privilege to provide a welcome to country. For me, it is a profound honour and a luxury of time given by you, and time of the many warriors that started the traditions for all of us. My people's practices are varied across these lands and our waterways. A welcome isn't just words, it is a reflection of where we are. Not our modern day places, but the continuous link of life, lessons, purpose, and nurturing supplies. I am on the land of the Eora, and our various boundaries across this continent are not defined by the hand, by the pen, but through the natural landscapes of the earth. The Eora Nation's country covers the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. Wherever you are, or wherever you travel across this beautiful continent of ours, understand entering the lands of nations, tribes, and clans that have existed here for over 65,000 years. The First Nations of this country are the oldest living culture of the world. And on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people and also the people's lands that you're on, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. As we're gathered online here today, let us all remember the many warriors that have created pathways for all of us, the ones recognised and those we've never heard of. My people's stories aren't myths. They are this land's history that has been passed on from one generation to the next. There have been many lessons learned at our expense and our devastation. They should and must be acknowledged, not out of a guilt, but to listen, learn, and to come together. My people, we had our land taken from us and put into homes. Then we had our homes taken to only go back to the land where our connections were removed, and some were completely destroyed. Dispossession continues in the disconnect. So as you connect, learn, and share today, tomorrow, and beyond, continue to make a difference. Make sure that this homelessness and also our continual disconnection from our lands and our people does not continue into our future. Don't lose sight of the important work that still needs to be done to bring my people, your people, and all our people together. We need to work together to stop the isolation from the security of our homes, from the affordability of accessing housing, and stop the isolation from each other, from one community to the next, from one person to the next, creating a society we can be proud of. All of us can bring about positive changes to multiple generations. And we have that responsibility to continue to do that in everything that we do. So we need to make an inclusive future. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, sorry about that. Today we've got the New South Wales Planning System webinar, which the three peaks, Homelessness New South Wales, DV New South Wales, and the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association have prepared with lots of support from Shelter and a number of other partners that are working on the presentation today, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. I just wanted to let people know that this is part of a series of resources and supports that that as a group, the Three Peaks are providing for organisations that are involved in the procurement for core and cluster refuges. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. First, the Q&A functionality. We're using the functionality in the system, so please add your questions whenever you like to the Q&A, type those in, and we'll deal with those questions at the end of the presentation. We'll go through those one at a time. Also, if you'd like to remain anonymous with your question, that's fine. Just choose that option when you're entering your question. Also, there'll be a survey towards the end of the webinar, and we'd ask everybody to complete that to provide some feedback about today's webinar. Okay. So our first presenter today is Stacey Myers from Shelter New South Wales. Stacey has worked extensively as a senior town planner in local government, as well as work at the interface between town planning, social, environmental, and cultural impacts over many decades. Stacey's going to talk to us about, he's going to provide an overview of the New South Wales planning system. Stacey.
I'm just, I thought my PowerPoint was open. So I just, there it is. Why is it not letting me share it? There. Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Looks right. It is in slideshow, I presume. But does it? Yeah, it's definitely working. I'll just go back there. All right. Sorry about that. So this is just a guide to undertaking a development procedure. It's not, doesn't really want to deal with the whole planning system. People have individual questions, they're welcome to ask them down the track. I'd like to acknowledge country. I find this is a lovely proverb that links with the kind of concept of planning and what we learned from First Nations people about our relationship to land and the future. We are all visitors to this time, this place, just passing through. Our purpose is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then return home. And I think that's kind of fits with the whole idea of planning and sustainability in a bigger context. So, sorry, I'm going to try and get rid of this view up here. So sorry, where is it gone? Why is it running? Yeah. Really, you need to think first about how to shape your vision about what you want to build. Do you want a new dwelling, or do you want to make alterations to an existing dwelling? That will actually inform the planning decisions that you make. Look at what is possible on your land and look around your block and see how your dream can actually fit on that piece of land. Talk to council up front with information on about the following issues. Find out about your zoning rules primarily. Seek an informal pre-DA meeting. If your block is difficult to develop or you want to vary existing development standards. So if you don't want to go down an easy pathway, make sure you actually talk to the council about it first. This is about the structure of the planning system itself. So there's the Environment Planning Assessment Act, and it's the overriding legislation. And then under that, there are the Greater Sydney Regional Plans, and there are also district plans, and there are specific regional development plans. There's also things that are referred to as state environmental planning policies, and there's a particular SEP called the Housing SEP, State Environmental Planning Policy, and it allows you to build certain kinds of developments that they see as addressing unmet housing needs. And some of the developments that might be relevant to you are actually in that instrument. There's also State Environmental Planning Policy Exempt and Complying Development Code, which actually allows you to build developments that don't need a development application. There's also what are called local housing strategies. Every council has to actually do a local housing strategy, and the local housing strategy will usually tell you what your current unmet housing needs are. So it will tell you what percentage of dwellings aren't affordable, if there is need for a women's refuge, or supported accommodation options. It will actually identify it in that housing strategy. The two main planning instruments that come out of at a local level is the Local Environmental Plan, the LEP, and it actually really identifies the land uses and what you can do on those land uses. There's also what are called development control plans, and they actually don't deal with, they kind of aren't something you can go to court over, but they should actually inform the development decision. So this is actually, you can go to the New South Wales Planning Portal. You can enter your property address on that portal and it'll tell you what the zoning rules are for a particular property. And it'll give you a property report printout, as you can see on the, I think I did Homelessness New South Wales for this one. Their zone and what categories they are and what's permissible. So it's a mixed use B4 zone. So it will, so you can put that in and it'll immediately tell you the zone and it'll tell you all the rules that relate to the zone on your land. And those rules, this is technically the zoning map. So it'll also show you this. So the zones and the permissible land uses within whatever relates to your site, but also surrounding site. And it'll tell you if it's impacted by Aboriginal Land Council, heritage, conservation zone, those kind of issues that you might have to take into account if you're going to undertake a development. So there in the housing step, it lists a whole lot of development types that they see as not being met in the private market. And so one section relates to affordable housing, which are boarding houses, supported accommodation, social and affordable housing developments. And they're more about being able to acquire value uplift and other benefits to deliver those kind of products. The other are diverse housing. And so that kind of deals with all these others like build to rent, co-living, group homes, secondary dwelling, caravan, manufactured home estates, those kind of primary issues, housing and seniors. So probably the most relevant one for this sector at the moment is the group home. What I'd also like to say about the group home one, so I'm just pulling up the group home section in that housing policy actually only allows group homes in certain zones. So there's R1, R2, which are residential, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then on mixed use zones. So it's called MU1, and actually B4, so mixed use, and special activity zones, SP1 and SP2. Now that's actually really good if it's land council land, because a lot of land council land is actually zoned SP1 or SP2. They were zoned that under what was the old County of Cumberland plan. And then when they went across to all the new planning controls and what are now the Environment Planning Assessment Act and local environmental plans, a lot of them, the SP1 and SP2 zones still went over, and that's what land council lands are often zoned. So those zones can be quite restrictive, but the fact that group homes are permissible in those zones actually gives a lot of flexibility to actually be able to build group homes in those SP1, SP2. So it's really important to kind of look at the zones and what you can do, but also relate back to the housing SEP and what's permissible. So there's basically 3 types of developments. There's exempt developments, which means you don't need to do anything. You don't need an application. They're like sheds or carports or whatever. And then there's complying development, which the group homes fit in that particular, in those zones that are in the housing SEP. So, but there are other kinds of developments, like you might just a residential home or there's a few complying development kind of, it's a massive legislation, the complying step. And then there's ones that need development consent. So they're ones where it's usually a major development, or it's actually affected by environmental amenity. So it might be that it's actually in a fire zone or a flood zone. Those kind of issues you will need, or it's in an urban area. There's always a lot more pressure in urban areas around these kind of developments. So group homes is actually a technical term used in the New South Wales planning instrument. It allows developments for a permanent group home or a transitional group home to be undertaken without consent if the development does not result in more than 10 bedrooms being in one or more group homes on a site. So technically you could even have like a residential flat building as long as it was a group home and it was within those zones where it's permissible. You'll still need to satisfy all the requirements for the complying development, such as, setbacks, floor space ratios, all the rest of the controls. You'll still need to take notice of them, not ignore them, but it is permissible. So I'd suggest pre-lodgement, you actually engage an appropriately skilled professional. This will reduce your chance of supporting documents not meeting the development standards. Some developers are happy not to meet the development standards, but that's because they've got a lot of money and they're prepared to go to court and continue to get ongoing amendments, but they're the big end of town. You may need an architect or a building surveyor or a town planner, depending on your site and what you're proposing. One of the things I'd be really clear about as well, and I see this a lot, the difference between fixed price contracts and cost plus contracts. So if you're signing a contract, be very clear about what you're signing. If the contract says that you're paying them up until they submit the development application or the certifying certificate, then that's a problem, because you may actually not get approval and you'll have to go back for ongoing amendment. And there's usually a clause in those contracts where there's an hourly fee. So you're better off to pay a bit more upfront and actually make sure that that it's actually approval of your development. And that way you're assured that they'll be engaged until you actually get your approval done. If you're commencing your development, what you need to take into consideration are the following. Okay, get informed before you start. Look at the standard land use controls that apply, issues of solar access, passive design, ventilation, shadowing and overshadowing, depending on where the site is, of course. This is more important, particularly if you're in an urban area. Understand the standards that apply to your land in terms of floor space ratio. This will determine the floor area you can build on against the size of your block, and issues of building height. So sometimes your building height can be 8 meters, but you might be able to manage it if it's a sloping site where you actually get 3 stories. So that's where floor space ratio becomes really important. Okay, undertake a site analysis. So not all buildings and will fit on certain sites. So it's important to understand how your proposed development is going to actually be located within your land. And Polara will deal with that a bit on the case study, which kind of shows how the design and layout really impacts on what council see as permissible in terms of their other controls. A development application will it'll need to include a plan of the land, a level and locational survey, shadow diagrams, sketch of the development, an environmental statement of environmental effect, usually landscape plans, drainage plans, and BASICs, which is it will tell about the sustainability, how much sunlight to each room, cross ventilation, and those kind of issues. If the development includes variations to the current standards, the report will have to justify all of that. So say there's an adjoining heritage building, you'll need that. You might need an arborist report if you're going to remove a whole lot of trees. Sometimes you'll need a noise report. And the quality of the application will actually affect how council accepts that process. So I won't do the Q&A because we're going to do that later. And I'll hand over to the next person. Stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. Next, we have a case study focused on core and cluster, the core and cluster approach, presented by Pilar from Shelter, New South Wales. Pilar is a strategic planner with significant local government and policy experience. Thanks, Pilar.
Good morning, everybody. As Dean just said, my name is Pilar Aberasturi. I work with Stacey Myers at Shelter New South Wales, and I have a extensive background in development assessment, both in local government and with state government, with strategic sites, and I'm currently working as a policy officer with Shelter New South Wales. Now, today, what I'm going to do is run through with you a case study for a core and cluster tender response for redevelopment of a refuge, a women's refuge in metropolitan Sydney. Now, I'm not going to run through every single document that you would need for your EOI and tender. As part of the process to DCJ, all I want to do just now is highlight a couple of things. You're probably already aware you'll need a partnership agreement to purchase or redevelopment LAC land, and the link's there. In this particular case, the organisation was a registered Tier 3 provider. And the one that I really want to talk about right now is the letter of reference. In this particular case, it was a letter of support from Council's Community Services Department, and we'll get on to how that happened and when it happened. All right. Now, in terms of the planning response or the development application documentation for this tender process, it just lists floor plans. The floor plans for this particular urban case were linked to the Department of Planning and Environment's functional design brief. And the main premise of a core and cluster facility as part of that functional design brief is to deliver more units compared to the existing group home. And in the functional design brief, it actually states the ideal is 6 units on a site. And when I say units, individual living units, which equates to about 12 to 20 people. And you can check that with the link at the back of this group of slides that I've attached for the functional design brief if you go ahead and use that. Now, in this particular case, Shelter, or we at Shelter, helped to prepare the development application compliance table with looking at those core and cluster requirements and working alongside the architect and the actual provider to make sure that we met their needs. And just to explain, how did that particular proposal respond to the core and cluster requirements and the site? I won't talk about the owner's consent. I'll come to that in a minute. All right. Now, what was the actual site? And what I'm going to do is just going to show you the site while I talk you through. The site was made up of two adjoining sites. It just makes it clearer if I give you the visual impression. We've got a street frontage at the bottom of the site, and that's where the north is. So that's where our sun orientation is. One of those sites, House 1, was an existing domestic violence refuge, and it was owned by the Tier 3 provider. House 2 provided support services for the refuge. This particular site was owned by LAC. In the tender process, I've already mentioned the partnership agreement to purchase or redevelopment LAC land, but also to lodge a development application, as in this case, because it involved a new build, it requires owner's consent on the development application form. If you're already going through the process of a partnership agreement with LAC, they probably are more than willing to sign that DA form. So you need the owner's consent to lodge the application over their land. All right, now I might just stay here on this particular page just for a moment longer to talk about the actual site or key features of the site and the adjoining sites. The site themselves have, you can see those little green star looking things, they're trees. So they were existing trees, and some of them mature trees, some of them identified in a tree preservation order by the council. The site also had a significant slope, about 5 metres from one side boundary to another. It had an existing driveway at the front, those two little lines at the bottom of the screen there. It had open space to the rear, and that corresponded with the open space of the two adjoining properties. So it was landlocked on 3 sides, 2 adjoining houses on either side of house 1 and 2, and to the rear, there was a heritage item. It's quite a significant distance. I haven't shown that. Nothing of this is to scale, but it just gives you an impression. And on that heritage item site, there was also a new building. It was like a 2-storey demountable classroom, but I've put it there because it plays into what happened in this particular case. Now, the actual proposal involved demolition of the 2 houses, amalgamation of those 2 sites, and that's where our owner's consent's coming in here, and the building of a 2-storey core and cluster facility for 8 independent living units clustered around core facilities, the admin and the support services, which were going to go front of house, and located over a basement car park with lift access. The Tier 3 providers' needs for the design, and I'm just going to flick you to the actual proposal itself so it makes it clearer for you, were an inward-looking design with a central open space for safety and security. So here you can see, obviously the demolition's gone. Now you've got floor plans which show 2 long flanks there. In the middle is the open space. That communal open space was accessible for the clients, for the staff. It included child's play areas. It had inward-looking balconies from the living units, and it was pet friendly. As I mentioned, there was internal lift access provided to the communal areas and to 2 accessible units from the basement car park. All units were universally designed to make it mobility and accessible to all, depending on your mobility needs. There was a range of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units, and there were dual key options. That just means that, say you have a 3 bedroom, but really you only need a 2 bedroom because you might be entering there with 2 children. You can actually secure one of those rooms off from your particular apartment. So it's like a shared arrangement, and it's very secure. All right, now I might just say that the initial site investigation was what is the initial site investigation? Basically, it's where we look at the policies governing the site. So one, I had to check, was the site occupied by a group home? Did the group home have consent within the particular zoning? Yes, it did. Could that group home be demolished and expanded? Yes, it could. It already had development approval to be or permissible. It was already permissible land use within that zone. Okay, who did we speak to for these site investigations? We spoke to the Tier 3 provider and we spoke to the architect. All right, now, there was no site analysis plan at this initial stage of the site investigation. The site analysis plan, and we'll get on, Stacey mentioned it, it analyses all of those key features of a site. And some of those key features, to make it really clear, are slope, open spaces, where are the setbacks, what are the building heights of the adjoining properties, where are the windows, because we could be looking at privacy, what's the orientation, what would be the best outcome for solar access, what are the building alignments to the street and to the rear and to the sides. Now, how does it respond to its context? So how does the design respond to the site and the context more effectively? Okay, so how does it respond to the streetscape? What's the building alignment to the streetscape? Where are those adjoining properties? Okay, now I've already mentioned some of these things, which is the slope of the land, that there was a significant crossfall. If there is a significant crossfall, the floor plans were showing at this point extensive site excavation, which is it gets very, very expensive if you are doing significant excavation. It also played in to the actual floor plan, which meant you needed split levels and quite a few stairs, which is not making it an accessible design. And under the Development Disability Discrimination Act, you must have an accessible design, especially to communal areas, and those apartments were considered to be required to be accessible. We found that there were a significant number of trees on the site, and when we went out there, they were quite mature, some of them. There were some that looked to be located within the building footprint. At that point, there was no arborist report. The Tier 3 provider subsequently engaged somebody to locate all of those trees on the site, name what they were, what were their heights, what were the canopy sizes, and where were they located, and how did the design affect it or not affect it. At the site at the rear was a little bit more raised, and there were some sight lines a little bit distant, but it was there to a chimney of a heritage item. That comes into our conversations with the council, which happened next. So what happened next was we organised a pre-lodgement meeting with the council. And the reason that the pre-lodgement meeting was organised with the council is because the Tier 3 provider, as I said, they were going to demolish and expand the facility. That meant that this required a conversation with council to progress the viability of this development application. You want to get in early with these experts to find out, are there any pressing issues? Is it going to involve amendments? Is it going to involve a redesign? Okay, you can only know that. It can be a free process, or it is a feed process, sometimes not so expensive, sometimes can be waived. That would be a conversation you could have with council at the time. All right, now, at the pre-lodgement meeting, the council acknowledged that the refuge was an existing group home. The group home was permissible in the particular zone, okay? In other words, we knew it could be demolished and expanded, all right? What happened at that meeting? Council verbally and later, through contact with the Tier 3 provider, provided them a letter of support from Community Services. That went in with their tender application. All right. Now, what were some of the issues that they raised at this pre-lodgement meeting? They raised tree retention on the site. there was the council's tree preservation officer who indicated there was a tree preservation plan that applied to the site, that there was a need for us to identify where those trees were and what kind of impacts would be involved, and that their sort of guiding premise was retention of trees. The council's town planner also mentioned the need for trees because of the shade impact, or the benefits of shade because of the extreme temperatures. So that may apply significantly to regional areas, but it also is applying more and more and more, as we know, in urban areas. It also, the value of the trees is the privacy to the site and to adjoining properties. It provides a beautiful outlook for everyone. And it attracts birds, insects. It's just good common sense. All right. Now, they mentioned privacy impacts from the balconies of those individual living units facing each other. And also because of the design, possibility of privacy impacts to the adjoining properties, and the fact that just slapping on a privacy screen at either end of that two-flanked floor plan was not going to be acceptable. They wanted the privacy to be integrated with the design, not to be an afterthought that we would need to address. There was an issue that they raised about the front building line setback, and the front building line of the proposal was quite significantly set back from the street. It also had a flat, like a unarticulated building frontage, and it was 28 metres in length, and the council raised that they'd need to break it down to better relate it to the pattern of development in the street. And there's ways to do that. Your architect can do that. They can articulate that building by bringing out a little bit in and out, in and out, in and out. They can break the building bulk. There's a lot of little techniques they can employ there. Now, they also mentioned sightlines to the heritage item at the rear, but thankfully, Stacey and myself, we had been out to the site and we noticed that the rear fence height was significantly higher than the standard fence. The standard fence is 1.8 metres high. This was like 2.2 metres high. There were significant mature trees at the rear, so the canopies were actually like blocking a lot of the view. And there was that new building that was, it was built like about a metre and a half from the rear fence of the subject site, and it was 2 stories in scale. It was quite large. So it was very difficult to sort of see anything of that heritage item, which was was actually at distance on the actual site itself. As a consequence of that conversation there, so this is where getting in early, getting your expertise, getting on board these experts early on helps, because as a consequence of that in the pre-lodgement, they didn't think they needed a heritage consultant or heritage architect to provide a report. We also offered to go out on site and check what the sight lines to the heritage item were, and we did that, found it very difficult to view that. However, heritage still remains something in the background there. There was also something that they raised, which was the visibility of the lift overrun from the street. It's more of an aesthetic issue to better integrate any lift overruns if you can disguise it better behind a parapet, which is just the little part of a wall that sits at the top. We're just getting a bit more sophisticated with that as we go on these days. Now, following that pre-lodgement meeting, council wanted us to speak to the Urban Design Review Panel. And who are they? They're a group of urban designer, sometimes architects, maybe planner. They raise the built form issues that come up with an application. At this particular meeting, they mentioned there were some impacts with the extensive excavation on the site. They did notice that there would be extensive excavation. And they mentioned it from the point of view of, one, the site works, but also because of the accessible design. And there's quite significant level changes. Some of the stairs between internal areas and the communal open space were 1 metre high. So if you think a stair is, you don't take notice of it, but a stair is 20 centimetres. So every step you take is 20 centimetres, and our brain sort of incorporates that. We don't take it for granted. But if you've got a metre of that, or 1.5 metres in some cases, you're creating like slippery dips or something you'd see at the Easter show for children. So there was a need to sort of address that issue. And the Tier 3 provider wanted to do that. This was a consequence of the architectural plans being drawn up early on, which probably could have helped with a little bit more cross-referencing with the survey at that time. And the survey is done by the surveyor and it shows the contours on the site. All right. Now, they also mentioned that usability of that narrow communal open space that was accessible only by flights of stairs and the amount of overshadowing to it. However, at the time, we did put in the application like that purposefully to the council because the Tier 3 provider did want that to be a secure and safe space. And it was temporary accommodation. It was a group home for transitional accommodation. It was not a group home for permanent accommodation. So people were not envisaged to stay there permanently. So there was a reason behind that. They did raise that, however, and they also mentioned that the front building line setback compared to the street context, it was quite set back, and there looked to be an opportunity to move that forward. To help resolve some of these issues, in that meeting, and the council weren't obliged to do this, but the urban designer went back to the functional design brief and had a look at something that might sort of start to help us move toward an amendment that could make it work on that particular site. And what they did was, this is on one of the pages, I think page 8 of that functional design brief. You can go and check it later if you like. What they suggested was a T-shaped design. You can't see that there because what ended up being what was considered to be the most viable was a T-shape for that site, as based on their advice. But they mentioned this particular, or referenced this particular design because they showed how core facilities the administration and the support services could be provided front of house, as you can see in that main entry where the street is at the bottom. You can see the administrative support. To the rear, I'm going to just flick down through my slide here. I'm going to show you, this is what she basically drew on a piece of butcher paper in the meeting for us. And she showed a T-shaped design, and she ran through what she thought were the benefits for this particular site. She didn't ignore what the proposal was, which was the building proposal, which was a floor plan involving 2 buildings, which we saw earlier. She said, generally speaking, that could be a good outcome. But because of the particular features of this site, because of what's going on the adjoining sites, a T-shape is a better outcome for this site. That's how we got to this. What were the benefits? By having the T-shape, we were able to, well, she was able to move that building closer to the street, the existing street alignment. That meant the building was moved away from that rear boundary with the heritage item at the rear there. They were able to minimise the extent of excavation and the type of site works that would be needed, and therefore, you know, ching, 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 the cost, because that's where the cost comes in, and create a level building floor plan. This also enabled relocation of the lift to a more central location. So it dealt with the street issue of the visibility, and it originally only provided 2 of the living units with access. It now was going to provide access to all the living units within this design. It also helped to ensure that the on-site trees could be retained for their shade, for their privacy, and for their outlook benefits. It also helped to create a better internal amenity for all the living units. No longer were those balconies looking into each other. They were looking into deep soil areas on either side of that rear flank. You can see what I'm looking at there. They had an outlook into gardens. They've got an outlook into beyond that, into open space, which marries up better with the pattern in the street. Okay, the building pattern. It also improved the privacy to not only to themselves, but to the adjoining properties, to the open spaces and to any windows. It removed the building bulk that was across the rear boundary to the site. Remember I mentioned earlier, it had a 28-metre frontage, the original building. So the 28 metres across the entire back of the block was removed. And as a consequence, that obviously, arguably, opens up vistas to the heritage item at distance at the back there. So if you're talking about a good fit, you're really aiming high here. Now, I might just draw on some of the conclusions. What were the conclusions from this? Okay, the conclusions were that the floor plans, the supporting documentation, the planning documentation, the council's advice, all was used to combine and make for a successful tranche funding application in this particular case. All right, the redesigned T-shape was worked up into a viable development application, which is currently going through council now. So what were some of these lessons that we learned? A site analysis plan, it's key. It's absolutely key to a good design. It makes the best of those site key features. It creates a more simple and efficient and cost-effective development application process. In this case, there's no way of getting around a development application. You had to submit one. The Tier 3 provider was very proactive in this process and really got on board with council's community services, got their support. The whole council was on board with this particular application. What's another lesson learned? Get your professionals and your specialists on board early so that you can get a better informed design. What does that mean? Architect or the building designer's plans should be cross-referenced with a registered survey. If you need an architect, council will let you know for a new build. If you do not need an architect, you may be able to get away with a draftsperson. You need to double check that. That could be a cost saving there. What is some of the other early input from specialists? I think with the capacity building, based on the expertise, I would recommend a town planner, an arborist, depending on what are those trees on site, an engineer if there's excavation involved, and possibly a heritage architect, as we mentioned. Finally, just to state that with the capacity building, as far as I understand, that ACHIA or CHIA have an in-house town planner. Shelter, also available if you need some expertise with this going forward. Now, what are some of the documents that might just help you along? There's a link there to the functional design brief. It's best practice and it's specific for crisis accommodation, domestic violence crisis accommodation. And in this particular tender application is what was used. There's also the Housing Plus and Custard's Architects design guide. I haven't used that one personally, but Samantha is going to talk you through with that one. And just in terms of universal design, always really good to consult the Livable Housing Design Guidelines, and there's a link to that. And that's it for me. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Pilar.
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we have Amelia, who's going to talk about Aboriginal land councils and land dealings. Amelia is from Chalk and Barrent lawyers, and she's joined by colleagues Chris and Elizabeth, who will be available for questions at the end. They work with the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association, and we'll talk about Aboriginal land councils and land dealings. Land council land is a possible option for core and cluster projects. Thanks, Amelia.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, so the reason we're giving this presentation is because Loucks are some of the largest private landholders in New South Wales, so their land is really going to be a key resource for community crisis housing and generally addressing the housing supply shortage in New South Wales. There we go. So by way of a bit of a background, many of you probably are already familiar, at least to a certain extent, with the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, but I'll just give you a brief overview. So it was introduced in 1983. Notably, that's pre-native title. So this was one of the first land rights systems in Australia. And it was introduced to have a dual purpose. So in one aspect, it was intended to be a way of providing spiritual and social and cultural connections for Aboriginal people to their land. But primarily, it was also intended to be a means of economic development for Aboriginal people, a way of them achieving a level of economic independence. So that it was always intended that they would develop and earn an income off some of the land that they received under this land rights system. So then the ALRA established a network of 120 Loucks across New South Wales, and their borders are sort of similar in scale to local government areas, but they sometimes kind of roughly overlap, but there's a lot of differences as well. So this slide shows those boundaries. We're looking at the red boundaries, not the sort of coloured regions, which for most parts, most of the utility of that sort of regional division has largely been removed. But yeah, the red boundaries is what we're looking at. The ALRA also created a couple of other entities. We've got the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, and Newswalk plays a sort of regulatory role, providing oversight to local Aboriginal land councils, and importantly, it plays the role of approving all potential land dealings that a Louck wants to undertake. They also provide funding to Loucks, and they have like a policy law reform sort of role, providing advice to government. And they also make claims on behalf of land councils, especially in the last few years. That's been a high sort of policy priority for Newswalk. So you might find if you're looking at whether there's a land claim over a parcel of land, it may actually be made by the state land council on behalf of whatever local Aboriginal land council is the right one for that area. And the other key entity is the Registrar of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, who maintains the register of land claims and plays a few other roles, including approving the rules that the Loucks have to operate under, and plays a sort of compliance, investigation and dispute mediation role. So the first thing you're going to have to do if you're considering using Louck land for a housing project or a crisis housing project is undertake a bit of due diligence. You have to do this with any developer, but the things you look for with Louck land are going to be unique to land councils. So the things proponents should do, they want to engage early with the land council's executive, their CEO and their board, to understand first and foremost if the proposal fits within the Land Council's strategy and aligns with its community land and business plan. Now, in our experience, the land and business plans, the CLBPs, are usually very broad, and they almost always will contain something in relation to housing, especially housing for Aboriginal people. So it's almost always going to be the case that it will already sit within the CLBP. But if not, CLBPs can be amended. You'd also want to review the LAUC's land holdings to identify appropriate sites. And you want to understand some of the constraints and the compliance requirements under the ALRA that some of those sites are going to have. And so we'll talk about those compliance requirements in a bit more detail. So essentially, under the ALRA, a land council cannot deal with land unless it has first, if the land was vested in the LAUC in response to the under the ALRA, and it was a claim made after 28th November 1994, basically after the Native Title Act came into effect, then the LAUC will need an approved determination of native title over that parcel of land. And they're also going to need member approval and approval of the State Land Council before they can deal with their land. And we'll talk about each of these three constraints in a bit more detail, but first I'm just going to give a little overview of what I mean when I say deal with land. So this is also set out in the ALRA. Basically, deal with land is almost anything you can imagine doing with land. So creating any kind of interest in the land, selling, leasing, mortgaging, disposing of the land, granting an easement or a covenant over the land, entering into a conservation agreement. So for example, a biodiversity stewardship agreement under the current Biodiversity Conservation Act, subdividing or consolidating the land, and making or consenting to a development application over the land of a value of more than $500,000, which is pretty low and would capture a lot of development applications. So the only things that don't need NSWAC and member approval, so they're still dealings, but they don't have the same constraints, is a lease for a period of less than 3 years, including any option to review. And also similarly, a short-term residential tenancy agreement of less than 3 years, other than a social housing management lease. And as I said, a lower value development application, estimated cost less than 500,000, and rezoning, which is good. It means you can, if there is an issue with the particular land use not being permitted in the zone, at least it can be rezoned without having to go through all this process. So when we're assessing native title constraints, as I said before, basically all land vested in a LAUC in response to an ALRA claim that was made after the Native Title Act came into effect is subject to native title. This is just basically a way that the government decided to deal with the potential conflict between the existing land rights system, which came into effect in the 1980s, and the new native title system that came in the 90s. And the way they did it was they said, all right, you can have your land still under the ALRA, but anything we transfer to you is going to be subject to you dealing with any native title interests first. So LAUCs must seek an approved determination of native title from the federal court to deal with that land. This is proper litigation. It takes time. It can minimum 1 year, but can be longer for contested matters. And it can be quite costly as well. Litigation generally tends to be quite costly. So this is a pretty significant constraint, but it won't affect all LAUC land. So for example, if a LAUC obtains land some other way, not under the ALRA, for example, if it's been transferred under from the AHO as AHO housing stock, this won't apply. And also increasingly, LAUCs are starting to be a bit proactive with their non-claimants. So they might undertake a review of their land and do a bulk sort of non-claimant over a number of parcels that they think have development potential, even if they don't have a specific project already in mind. So this is something to ask the LAUC early on, basically, if they've got any land that is already free from this native title constraint, or if they're going to need to do a non-claimant over the parcel that you're interested in. So the approval by members and Newswalk will apply to all land. A LAUC has to, in order to get this, they have to arrange a meeting of their members. You've got to get 7 clear days notice. The quorum for a LAUC meeting is 10% of their voting members, which is fairly small. Most LAUCs have membership bases in the sort of hundreds, 300-400 maybe, bigger, sometimes bigger for the bigger East Coast LAUCs. So 10% can be relatively small. And a resolution approving a land dealing has to be passed by 80% of members present at the meeting. So as you can tell, that does mean it doesn't take a lot of people. If you have a small turnout at a meeting, still quorum it. It could only take a few sort of disgruntled people to derail a meeting. So this is potentially another constraint to be aware of. The land dealing will also require approval of Newswalk. So Newswalk will review the sort of land dealing. They'll check that the member approval was obtained properly. And they'll also review the land dealing to make sure that it's not contrary to the interests of the LAUC or to interests of Aboriginal people generally in the LAUC's area. If Newswalk is happy with it, they'll issue a dealing approval certificate, which may be subject to conditions. And then once you're ready to, if it's going to require a dealing to be registered at the Land Titles Office, they'll then issue a registration approval certificate, which basically tells the Land Titles Office that, or Land Registry Services, sorry, that the particular dealing has met all of Newswalk's requirements and it's good to be transferred, good to be registered. For longer and more complicated land dealings, for example, you know, if you want to, if you've got starting with a large block of completely vacant land and you want to first subdivide and into separate lots, build buildings, houses or whatever, and then sell them on to final end users, that sort of takes a few different land dealings. And rather than having to go back for approval each time, Newswalk can enter into these land dealing approval agreements. So for the initial, you might transfer the land initially into a sub entity that doesn't have to go through all the land dealing approvals. It can still have this land dealing approval agreement that will run with the land. It's registered on the title of the land, and all of the Newswalk's potential conditions throughout that whole development process are maintained with the land, and that can bind any third parties. So if the LAUC has a development partner, they will be a party to that land dealing approval agreement. So in sort of summary, if you're thinking about using LAUC land for some of these projects, the key things to remember is that you need to engage early with their executive and their board to undertake the due diligence that we've sort of discussed in this presentation. You should be expected to be invited to present at that LAUC members meeting. So make sure you have enough information at the time to be able to give members an informed view of what they're giving consent to. And you're also going to want to engage Newswalk early for any proposal where their approval is required, which is everything except for those short-term leases and smaller development applications. So as you can probably tell from this presentation, there are a lot of unique constraints with LAUC land, but I think you're going to have constraints whatever developer you work with. There's always going to be a level of negotiation and figuring out what constraints are on that developer's land. And you're going to have to engage early no matter what. So I guess, but yes, being mindful of the specific constraints on LAUC land and making sure we're engaging early with those key players.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, as Amelia says, you know, every project, every due diligence has its unique aspects to it. And we think this is, you know, engaging with the LAUCs is like any other project. When you're doing a complex project, there's a lot of different moving parts. Yes, you need to understand the unique moving parts in relation to LAUCs and Newswalk. We've gone into a lot of detail in this to kind of give you that picture of it. but it's certainly something that people are doing and engaged in. And, I think important not to think, oh gosh, this is all too hard. It's actually just a pathway, like any pathway, and you just need to approach it with time and strong kind of engagement like you would with any joint venture.
Thanks, Liz. And that brings us to the end of ours. We'll do questions at the end, but thanks very much, and back to you, Dean.
Okay, thanks, Amelia and Elizabeth. I encourage everybody to add any questions they've got to the Q&A functionality on any of the presentations so far. Please just put those questions in as we go, and we'll deal with those after all the presentations. So the next presentation we have is from Samantha, and she's a lecturer at UTS and an interior architect. She has extensive knowledge and experience in design of crisis accommodation for women and children leaving violence, and is currently undertaking a PhD in this area. Samantha is a highly regarded expert on trauma-informed design and domestic and family violence services. Today, Samantha will present on trauma-informed and appropriate design for core and cluster projects. Thanks, Samantha.
Thank you, Dean. That was excellent. Not used to being introduced like that. That's great. So today I will present to you some of the work that I've been doing, both in my PhD, but also as a consultant, looking at existing projects, hopefully to help you be able to understand different strategies for working through your own applications. So the aim of a core and cluster building is to present a good practice principle of the aim of this presentation is to talk through good practice principles and also to cover strategies that integrate trauma-informed design based on trauma-informed practices. So trauma-informed practice is what the service providers deliver, and trauma-informed design is meant to address the needs of both staff and residents in projects, and think about ways that the physical environment can support the very complex needs in that situation. There are 10 good practice principles that I'll go through with you today. They're principles that I've been working with in a design guide that is focused on urban refuges. And these principles were taken from interviews that I'd done with a series of 11 different service providers. So these were themes that were reoccurring during the interviews, and I thought they were definitely important to the service providers, but they're also very clearly linked to the way that the built environment could be improved. So I'll take you through a series of architectural strategies that address each of the principles in turn, and I'll try to explain as we go the way that trauma-informed design can be implemented specifically for a core and cluster type facility, but they can also be implemented in existing refuges that are going through a renovation process or an addition of new spaces out the back, which is commonly occurring in a lot of New South Wales refuges at the moment. And note that variations in location, climate, community, land size, and available funding, all of these variables change quite radically. So there's no one size fits all for any of these. So when we're talking about building types, it's dangerous to think of a one size fits all solution. The first principle is about safety. So some of the strategies to increase the experience of safety on a site is to think about clear views of the entrance is one of the primary needs. So clear view of the entrance as you're coming in, but also from the interior of the building, looking outwards. The clear view lines can create a sense of safety for both residents and staff that are in the refuge at the time. And often refuge providers will work hard to create a layered entry sequence. So this starts from the street boundary where There might be a fence, and then there might be a safety gate that is fobbed that you get through before you even reach the front door. There's also a series of gates that are often put up when there are children in the refuge so that the children are kept safe from running out onto the street as well. Other strategies are to do with access for deliveries and services. So thinking about how services and deliveries can easily be brought into the refuge but not compromise the safety of the residents, because often that's a point of weakness where somebody coming into the refuge who's an unknown needs to be monitored really carefully. The entry needs to be screened from the street, and the refuges tend to prefer being screened from the street for purposes of anonymity, but careful not to create a sense of prison-like atmosphere, and screening completely is sometimes really oppressive, and it can cause a lot more anxiety than it should. Other strategies involve controlled access, so having somebody close to the front door. So in some refuges that are really small, you won't have a reception space, but having somebody that is kind of overlooking the front door and making sure that people coming and going are monitored is really important, and it's good for residents to know who they can go and speak to if they need to check in with somebody. Connect the indoors with the outdoors. So the perception of safety, particularly for residents who are often in high states of trauma, just knowing where they can go to if they need to escape quickly gives them a sense of, it calms them down and gives them a sense of being able to move quickly. And safe children's play areas. Mums will often be quite stressed about where their children are and what they're doing. So just maintaining those clear view lines are really important. Security is different to safety. So security is more the tech of the building and how that works with the physical infrastructure. So things like CCTV, having safety gates. Duress alarms are usually placed in each of the units, but they're also often put in the office spaces as well. And they're hooked back to an external security system. Security screens and on doors and windows are often the things that refuge providers need fixed, or they need them actually integrated in their refuge. Often some of the new builds, they're forgetting to put good screens on the doors so that you can open the door in summer but not compromise your safety. And screens on windows are really important for the same reason. CCTV is always at the entrance, but the security experts should also check around the boundaries to make sure that any weak links are screened. Safe parking areas so that staff can leave at night and feel safe about getting to their cars. Quality fencing, which doesn't necessarily mean really tall fencing. It just means that the fencing needs to be strong and easy to maintain landscape. So sometimes landscape overgrows and obscures the view of CCTV. So it's really important to maintain the landscaping. And also because keeping the landscape well maintained means that it's obvious that somebody lives there and you're less likely to get broken into. So that's part of the kind of crime prevention strategies that are more wide-reaching. Quality exterior lighting is something that often needs to be upgraded in older style refuges. Women will often want to go and hang washing out at night when the children are asleep, or often they'll go in the backyard and smoke. So having lighting which makes them feel safe is an added bonus. For the trauma-informed aspects, the most commonly talked about strategy is reducing environmental stresses. So things like loud noises, banging doors, flickering lights. The old fluoro lights are often really stressful and they look institutional. So making sure that the lighting is better quality than you'd find in a 1950s school is important. Strong patterns upset some people in high states of trauma, and heat, vibrations and strong smell. So perfume and the smell of cooking is sometimes quite triggering for some people. So being able to manage those is often easier because of the core and cluster arrangement where families are living in their own units. So it's important to think about how these aspects work in communal spaces and staff areas where there's shared facilities. Promoting access to landscape is a really easy way to make a space trauma-informed. Landscape does a lot of work in calming people down, distracting them from what they were stressing about, and just creating a sense of health and well-being for both staff and for residents. We've already talked a little bit about arrival space, but the arrival sequence is really important. It's the first point of contact for women and children coming into refuge. And if that arrival sequence is not carefully designed and created with a sense of welcome and calm, then often that will be the point at which women and children will either leave or go home. So if it's important to kind of invest some care into that particular space. And then also creating a quiet space for individuals who are in high states of distress so that they're not impacting other people within the refuge, and they can retreat easily with a bit of dignity is important. So just having available quiet spaces. Providing choice and independence is important. Often the women and children who are coming in haven't had choice or independence for often a long time. Non-institutional finishes, we've talked a little bit about already. So colours and materials can often play into the way a space immediately feels. And there are some colours that are considered more institutional than others. Natural light and ventilation can make any space feel a lot more home-like and calm. Co-designing with a service provider is one of the best things that you can do in terms of coming from a design background. The service provider knows what they need as a service, and they know a lot more about the residents' needs than designers and building experts will. So making sure that communication happens throughout the design process from the beginning and through the council application stage, and then also through construction is really key. And then good acoustic control throughout. Noise is the probably most complained about aspect within any shared living arrangement. So being able to control acoustics is easy in the design phase. It's much harder to do as a retrospective fix, and it's more expensive. The next principle is privacy and dignity. So thinking about acoustic privacy again, making sure if often acoustics plays into people feeling like they can have a conversation and they feel in control of their space, which gives them a lot more dignity. On the same note, being able to open doors and window screens so that you can make the space feel like it's your own and you have a bit of agency over your space is important. Providing choice in communal spaces. So having where there's a meeting room, for example, not expecting people to all sit around the same table. Sometimes people will feel like they need to sit out for a bit but not be excluded from the meeting. So just having an alternative space to sit that's adjacent is often very helpful. Communal rooms for meetings and group activities. So thinking about how you can make communal rooms that are flexible so that they can be adjusted for large or smaller groups. And that they've also got good connection to exterior spaces for retreating. Views to landscape. Quite often when you look up, what gives a space a sense of dignity, it's often mostly about landscape and how easily a really beautiful garden can give a space a much better sense of worth. Providing privacy for families without isolating them is important. So there's a danger with the core and cluster model that the units are very isolated from the communal spaces. So making sure that there is a visual link and that there's a sense of welcome. And then considering accessibility and inclusion. So people need to feel like they are able to move around in their own way within and without within and the spaces, but also within the landscape. So furniture, lighting and finishes are a big part of making spaces much more accessible. The next principle is about flexibility and adaptability. So good storage option is having good storage options make a family feel instantly at home, and can also make the space much safer, particularly if there are small children, and give a sense of kind of dignity to the space rather than having all of your belongings on show. Similarly, with the staff, often staff spaces are the least well designed in refuges, and staff really do benefit from having good storage and having a place that they can arrange their workspace to suit their needs. Providing units that adapt to variations in family size is important. So the staff work incredibly hard to move bedroom furniture around so that it can accommodate different numbers of families who are incoming. We can help with that as designers by making sure that the rooms are easily rearranged and that the furniture is kind of easily placed to make it comfortable for different types of families. Sleeping area layouts is something that should be asked of the service provider. Often we will assume that a mum wants to sleep on her own in a separate bedroom, but families coming into refuge often sleep together because they've been through an experience where the mother actually would much prefer to have the children sleeping with her, and likewise with the children. So checking in with the service provider is really important to work out what they think is necessary. Then breakout spaces in communal areas, we've talked about a bit. Just maybe sometimes having a window seat is enough of a breakout space to kind of give people a sense of choice and being able to still be part of the conversation. Dining rooms for large and small families, thinking about flexible furniture, being able to extend tables or add chairs where necessary, and also thinking about the needs of different cultures. Some cultures prefer to sit on the floor and eat at mealtime. So mealtimes are really important for families in terms of re-establishing a routine, particularly with small children. So dining rooms and things like kitchens are incredibly important to get right. Also with accessibility, dining rooms and kitchens are super important. So seating in communal areas needs to suit diverse needs. Chairs are really useful for a certain part of the population, but not for everybody. So providing diversity is good. Thresholds, doors and bench heights should be considered when designing them so that there aren't unrealistic steps and edges of things that can cause accidents. Easy to use controls for lighting, air conditioning and equipment. So if the equipment is difficult to manage, often providers will provide a little a pamphlet for the residents so that they can operate their units quite easily. We can make it easier by designing it well as well. And kitchens, bathrooms and living rooms can have flexible bench heights that can move according to the needs of the residents too. So we don't have to stick with the standard. It's much more important to design for universal access, and it's much cheaper, and it's actually it makes for a much better built environment in the end. Safe, healthy gardens for companion animals. Often residents will come in with a companion animal, and being able to watch them and take care of them is important. Clear wayfinding, we've spoken about a bit. So being able to read a building is something that is often overlooked or only kind of considered necessary in the design phase, but it's not an obvious thing to everybody. And good internet connection is important. So making sure that access to internet is available to everybody in all the units is easy to fix in those beginning stages. The next principle is child focused. So integrating a children's zone in the counselling area is often completely overlooked. So in those spaces, sometimes there'll be children, but sometimes there won't. So it's really easy to design storage in so that you can have children's objects in the room, but not have to deal with them all the time. Some refuges have a creche or a childcare room, which is really useful, but it then needs to have a staff member present as well. Safe, independent and age-focused indoor and outdoor areas. Most of the children coming into refuge are under the age of 12. There are some teenagers and some students who are studying, so making sure that there are available spaces for children to do homework is one thing that often gets missed in refuges. Clear view lines between children and staff and mothers is super important. So just making sure that mums can easily watch their children playing and don't have to be kind of on top of them all the time. And so you can start to build up a sense of confidence. So this is a really easily spatialized solution, just creating spaces that are interconnected, but not kind of feeling like you're being watched over all the time. Storage for prams, change tables and baths, just to be able to put them away for safety reasons. And flexible furniture for diverse activities. Often children really appreciate being able to move chairs and sofas around so that they can play in different arrangements. Oh, that's not meant to be there. The next one is sustainable and operational principles. Thinking about what the service provider actually needs. So each region will have different climatic conditions that should be addressed specifically in each of the refuges. Maximising daylight and natural ventilation is a universal thing that we should be designing for, making sure that each room has really good access to natural light. It doesn't have to be sunlight, but just having a view outside can help people regulate and feel safe. Locating trees and shading devices to make sure that in summer the interior spaces don't get too hot, but that allow sunlight in during the winter so that the space can warm up without having to heat it is easy to do when you're designing the space. It can also be part of the renovation process. Provide instructions on how to operate doors and windows. So often architects will assume that people understand the idea of ventilation, and if you open 2 windows for cross ventilation at particular times of the day, it can really benefit. Sometimes it makes it much worse. So we as architects could help by, producing small pamphlets to help residents open and close windows and doors to help the thermal comfort. Sustainable materials that don't need to be repainted and replaced every few years will help the load on the staff. And creating sustainable garden spaces. Often there's an assumption that refuge residents love to garden and that we should give them vegetable gardens to look after because that will keep them happy. Every refuge that I've visited, the vegetable garden becomes a real burden for the staff at different times when residents are simply just not interested. So checking in with the refuge provider and asking them what type of landscape spaces is equally important. Culturally inclusive principle is about talking with local First Nations people, and doing this, as Amelia was saying, really early on is super important, just to understand what needs to be included and what's respectful in the way that the spaces are going together. Consult with the service provider about the different cultural, religious and spiritual needs that they have been experiencing within their service and that they assume will be ongoing. Culturally inclusive entry and furnishings. So often at the entry point, if you don't feel included because of your cultural background when you walk into the refuge because of something in the entry, that can make you less likely to stay. So thinking about beautiful artwork can help. Colours and local landscape can also make a space feel much more inclusive. Staff areas too. Often staff come from a diverse series of backgrounds, so thinking about what they need to work well. And adaptable communal areas to have different group activities that are culturally focused is really important. And then the final one is fit for purpose. So designing a space that is fit for women and children who are escaping violence, who have experienced trauma, is an exercise that needs to be really focused on the needs of the residents and the staff who are supporting them. So collaborating with the service provider, as we've been talking about, staff areas need to be tailored to meet their needs. So just providing an office space is often not adequate. They need to have spaces to relax. They need to have spaces to switch off, to regroup. Consideration of anonymity. Sometimes some refuges are much more concerned about anonymity than other refuges. So checking in on that is important. Material selection, robust and easy to maintain. The maintenance burden of the physical spaces falls to the service provider, and often they have enough to deal with, let alone working with having to fix the spaces all the time. So we can help that process by making spaces that don't need constant maintenance. Meeting passive and sustainable design requirements is important, particularly now that costs are going up, and designed to allow future growth in the staff area. So staff are kind of having to deal with really tight office spaces, and we can help that by designing larger spaces to begin with, or better organised. And that's the end of mine. Over to you, Dean. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Samantha. Okay, so we're going to move to question time now. If anyone has any questions, please add those to the Q&A functionality on the system. Okay, we'll move into those questions now. Sorry, I've lost the list. I'll start with this one. So regarding the DA application and community feedback, a lot of people in the community will have worries when they see a domestic violence centre is proposed for their neighbourhood. For the DA application, is it possible to use group home instead of domestic violence refuge? And a follow-up question, whilst the centres will be designed as secure, private, etc., there may be people that will object. Stacey or
Yeah.
Pilar, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think the issue is that if it's a group home, if it's a complying development, then just the neighbours get notified to the certifier, but I don't think they're notified until after the development goes ahead. So I think if it's a development application that it's going to become public knowledge, because it'll be in the council's records. Some of the councils have actually been good and not actually put group home. But the other thing is now, if there's more than, I think, 10 objections, I don't know, just have a quick look. If there's more than 10 submissions against a development, then that will actually trigger a process where it goes to the local planning panel. So then the local planning panel is not the council, so they don't have to worry about being re-elected, and they give independent approval and advice. So a lot of the time, if it, that means that the assessment process is independent from council and election pressures. So that, it's impossible to say that it won't be public, but there are the different pathways mean that it's less public in terms of if it's complying development as a group home compared to if it's a development application. But even then, if there's a lot of objections, then it would go to an independent planning panel, local planning panel, and then they would be the approving authority, not the council. Does that answer the question? I don't know who asked that question actually.
And I might just add as well that if it's an application for a group home, if it's the first time that that application is going through, what Stacey's saying would apply. In this particular case study, obviously the group home had permission and was operating as a refuge. Confidentiality was really important. The actual DA did not reflect any details of the provider at all, and the architect was used on the actual development application form, so all consultation was going through that one person, obviously informed then by the Tier 3 provider. However, their name is not on that application. That said, as Stace has just said, it would probably become apparent if they were advertising it as a refuge, and there's more than 10 objections. But like Stacey said, if it's going to an independent panel, That's taking it out of the elected representatives who are our councillors. It's taking it out of that community forum, which would assist a little bit. Does that help a little bit, whoever's asked that question?
Okay, thanks, Pilar and Stacey. Can I just add, just to be clear, the complying development pathway is by far the preferred option if it's possible for your particular project, because it's easier from a number of perspectives and quicker than a full DA process. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stacey or Pilar.
That's correct. The DA is generally about 3 months. In this particular case, the pre-lodgement and the urban design review panel meetings happened very quickly. The council was very receptive, and that's probably thanks to the Tier 3 provider having a good relationship with council as well, and making sure they were in contact with the community services area, and talking through that application. But generally speaking, an application full stop is about 3 months. So there are some cases like this particular one. There was no option to go through the complying development pathway, which has those preset standards. So this involved a merit assessment, but we were very specific. It's about the crisis accommodation DV model, not using development control plans for just general residential houses within their particular area.
Okay, thanks, Pilar. So the next question we have, for high density areas such as in a city, is it possible to look quite differently at planning and numbers?
What do you mean by that?
Stacey, you're on mute.
You can still do a development application for a group home in a high density area as long as it's, well, because you can do an R3. So you can technically do what is a residential flat building. It's a group home, but it can be in an R3 zone or an R4 zone. So the answer is yes, of course you can do it in a metropolitan area.
And all
you
types.
can do it as complying development.
Sorry, Stacey.
Yeah.
And all types of residential accommodation can be utilised for crisis accommodation, whether it's a single dwelling, 2 dwellings, dual occupancy, multi-dwelling housing, which is a 2-storey scaled terrace style housing, dual occupancy, which is 2 stories, manor houses, 2 stories, and low-rise residential flat buildings. So that's what's considered best use for the crisis accommodation. I'm only referring now to the Department of Planning functional design brief, not the Custance architects. So I don't know if Samantha, you'd like to say something there.
I think you've covered it, Pilar, but I think part of the problem is that people perceive core and cluster to be distributed units, whereas sometimes it's really useful to have them in an apartment style configuration. It's just the fact that they all need to have their own services, their own bathrooms and kitchens. And often the staff area can be in a separate apartment, so it complies that way. The Custance guides were more about the regional New South Wales site, so they tend to be more focused on regional areas.
Okay, thanks everybody. Next question. I think this is for Amelia and Elizabeth. What do you estimate would be the shortest time frame for successful land dealing from initial conversation to revealing all the necessary LAC approvals?
Yeah, that one is a potentially a hard one to answer because it's really going to vary depending on, well, first, like the clearest one is depending on whether there's a need to do a non-claimant application, which can take, as I said, upwards of a year. But I think the key thing is that a lot of these processes can be done concurrently with other planning and development applications. So if you know, like you can start the NCA on day one, as soon as you know you're going to be using the land, and let that just run in the background. And there's very little active involvement required from the LAUC and the parties. Generally, very little active involvement required from the lawyers. A lot of it is just submitting it and then waiting. With the actual members and a member approval and the Newswalk approval, again, you can start that process concurrently. So you're going to need to be getting a lot of information together for the development application anyway, as long as it's not exempt or complying, I guess. But so as you're starting to compile that information together, once you've got enough of it, you can go straight to members and get approval while you're finalizing the last little bits of the DA, as long as you've got enough information. It really depends. Like if you want to make it as fast as possible, you can try and get as many approvals in one. If there's going to be multiple land dealings, you can combine them into a single members meeting, as long as you've got enough information about what the subsequent land dealings are going to involve. Otherwise, if you're worried about lots and lots of land dealings, you can a LAUC can transfer land into a special corporate vehicle to undertake the rest of the project. That's the kind of thing that's probably going to attract one of those land dealing approval agreements that I spoke about from Newswalk. So yeah, it may add some time to a normal non-LAUC development process, but a lot of this can be run concurrently, I guess, with the normal planning. It's just a matter of how organized and efficient everyone can be.
Amelia, can I ask a question? So my understanding is quite a lot of the LAUCs are actually registered community housing providers anyway. And so say it's a group home development and they've got a special purpose zone anyway, and it's permissible in that zone as a group home, then you don't have to go through all that process. Is that true, or is that not true?
Well, if it's already got housing on it, then it's probably not going to need a non-claimant, so that we wouldn't need. If it's already being used as community housing, for example, and it's just a matter of leasing it, then it wouldn't, for a short-term lease, then that wouldn't require member and Newswalk approval. But if it's developing building something new on the land, then
if it's owned by the LAUC and they're a registered community housing provider and it's permissible in the zone.
I might need to take that one on notice.
I think so. Stacey, just to circle on that. So if it's permissible in the zone, then I guess it would depend a little bit on what you're looking to do. But if it's, if for example, it is exempt and complying, or if the DA is under 500,000, I think, Amelia, then that won't trigger the Newswalk approval. So it may be it may require, would have to, it certainly would be one that obviously the LAUC would do its own review in terms of DD and what kind of member buy-in. But you would think something like that, really wouldn't add any significant time into this kind of process. So I think, look, certainly there's a lot, as you say, there's a lot of LAUCs that do have, they are existing providers, they do have that housing stock, and to the extent that you are looking at that housing stock, often which has come across from AHO in the past, then they can be, I think, in some regards reasonably, if not reasonably straightforward, no more complex than any other site that you might be looking at. They're just, different, if that makes sense. And look, yeah, one question would be, well, is it the LAUC that is doing it? Are they granting any interest in land, or are they just partnering with others? So that structural piece is always really critical from a legal sense, actually kind of really teasing out what interest does everybody need to make sure that we have the right kind of setup early on.
Yeah, because my experience is a lot of the lots have land, they have the appropriate zoning, they just don't have the money to deliver the product. So if the money's available, then anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, particularly if the money's available and they can kind of set that up in a way that doesn't involve them passing on an interest in land or granting an interest in land, but that money is actually supporting them to do this in some way that's, you know, structured appropriately, then I think that's a quite an effective way, I think, to achieve that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. There's another question I'll go to shortly, but I just wanted to let everybody know that we've put a survey, valuation survey up in the chat. So I'd appreciate it if everybody can click on that link and complete that survey. So that's there if people want to complete that before they leave today. Okay, the next question. Any tips for finding an architect or draftsperson at a local level that specialises in this area? Or is it best to find someone at a state level that has expertise in the specialty use?
I can answer that one, Dean. So I've got contacts with architects that I've met through doing the PhD. So I can send you some contacts of people they've got good connections to council, and they've also got some good experience with working with service providers.
Okay, if that's okay, if you pass those on to me, Samantha, tomorrow we'll send all the participants in today's webinar an email, and we'll include those details if that's okay.
But maybe just a heads up, Sam, that it's always good to use someone who understands the controls in that local government area. You know, sometimes you can employ a planning consultant or an architect who doesn't understand the local controls, and that can really bog down your process. So if it's possible, it's always good to find someone who understands that particular LGA.
I think the issue is having architects who don't understand the needs of the service providers. That's a really big issue, and that they assume things as trauma informed just because they've kind of checked off a couple of the boxes. So it's really difficult. You're right, you've got to have both sides of it.
Okay, if there are any other questions, please put those up now, because we're about to finish the webinar. If everybody, as I mentioned, could complete that survey, that would be appreciated. If there's no more questions, we might bring the webinar to a close. So I just want to thank all the presenters, particularly who joined us today. And in particular, Stacey and Samantha and Pilar, who've been working with us to put together this webinar and on the content for some time now. So actually, there is one more question that I missed. Sorry. Just gonna chat here. Okay, so I'll read out this question. So we have advice from council and a formal town planner that the core and cluster does not meet group home definition due to the independent nature of the dwellings. This may be unique because we're in a RUT zone, and maybe that's the issue. Or maybe this is a wider issue. Stacey or Pilar, did you want to respond to that?
I think the issue is the zone, not the permissibility. So the zones are pretty clear about where the group homes are permissible. So I think it's more to do with the zone, but Pilar might want to add something to that.
The only thing that I would say is that there's no distinct dwelling type associated with group homes. So it's just residential accommodation, and it covers various typologies that we mentioned just before, from a single dwelling right through to a low-rise residential flat dwelling. So I think what's important is if you're seeking a group home application and you're specifically referencing, like in this particular case, the best practice for crisis accommodation, say from the department, I can't see a problem with the independent living units clustered around the core facilities, which include your administration and support services, being knocked back on the basis of the way that you have designed that. I think you might need to be getting some clarification, like Stacey's just mentioned, about the actual zoning, because if in the zone a group home is permissible, the first place I would then go to is the guidance on what is best practice. And I'd seek out this particular domestic violence crisis accommodation functional design brief, and I'd have a look in there. What are the types of buildings for residential development? Does ours meet that? Yes, it does. What is our proposal? Are we setting it out with independent units clustered around those core facilities? Yes, we are. And I'd have a conversation with council. So council might even be able to clarify something for you there, especially with the zoning.
Can I just add something? Because I heard about this case, a similar case in one of the regional discussions where it couldn't be passed. It was being rejected by council because of the core component, because that's then classed as an ancillary building. It's not residential. So they're a whole different classification, and that was jamming the council approval process.
Samantha, were they two separate buildings?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's often the case where you'll have the core in a completely different building, and because it's not residential and it's an office building, that falls under a different classification. So they were needing to kind of arrange the buildings a bit differently and then work out how to class them so that they could get a certifier. The problem was getting a certifier too to approve it.
Okay,
Even
so
once
they need
they're
to integrate, is what you're saying. They need to better integrate the core facilities with the independent living units. And
or
I'm
just
sure
check the classification with the planner. Yeah.
Okay, we're at time. So unless there was any other pressing questions, we might close the webinar there. Thanks everyone for participating. As I mentioned, we'll send an email out tomorrow, which will have details of the various resources and contacts in it. Thanks everyone for participating, and thanks to all the presenters. Bye-bye.